Welcome to this episode of YouTube where it's been clear and cold, and that means we've got a lot of kind of messy enclosures, no fresh snow to cover up some of the older areas. Certainly, Luna's expression kind of is how we all feel. You know, since Groundhog's Day, we'd be happy if there were 6 more weeks of winter, but we are in the midst of, solid ice, certainly compacted areas. A little bit of a concern for Aiden because, again, he's been isolating himself to the den. Even though he's got a water there, he's kind of psychologically not drinking. So he's eating this dry snow that's kind of crusted, and that's causing us a little bit of concern. But we're making a little headway with him. So the wolf care staff to wheel in the food, and we have the pack typically rallying around the wheelbarrow and getting ready. And you see now Aiden on the upper right, he's kind of moved from the den to in front of the window. We've added cover hay there, and you can see his breath there, sub-zero temperatures, and he's coming off of that area approaching the pack, so that's a really good thing. You know, his desire to get some food is driving him to overcome some of his anxiety, and so he is offered a deer leg, which we thought he would just take and go back up to the bed. Instead, he decided to stay, and he's right around the carcass, and so we're trying to isolate, which wolf, which circumstance, where does he have intimidation, and it doesn't seem to be with the Arctics as much, although in the last couple of days we've certainly seen a little bit more hormonally driven behavior from the Arctics that's causing them to maybe add a little bit of anxiety towards Aiden. But here on the Saturday night feeding, he has no problem grabbing a torso and dragging it, and that's, like I said, we offered him a whole leg and he took the whole deer. So that was a great kind of period of confidence, and certainly no doubt these colder temperatures, driving his hunger a little bit. But that's a concern for us, is that as we don't get a lot of snow and we have this colder weather, that, we add a little dehydration problem to not feeling confident, and then you add a little dehydration where you're not feeling well, and that's a little concerning to us. So we've been trying to get him to drink water because he has a heated water right there, but he's just not doing it. And so that's something that we've been kind of watching. Took a urine sample down and the other day, and he was clean of any crystals or any kind of issues that he'd had in the past. But certainly that's something that we want to watch for. So this was a good thing. Like I said, Bolts is on one other carcass over there with Denali. And then Grayson and Axel are coming to feed right on the same carcass that Aiden is. And Aiden's not showing a tucked tail. He's not concerned at all about Axel coming in. As a matter of fact, walks down and turns his back to Grayson and Axel, which tells us again that he's, not having some anxiety issues. But what was interesting, so again, that was the feeding on the 10th. What was interesting, by the 12th, 2 days later, we get some surveillance footage of Bolts doing food begging towards Denali. So that's 2 days after the carcass feeding, and so whether Bolts was able to get enough food or not was questionable. One thing on the feeding footage that kind of cut off before we were able to capture it, actually we did see Aiden drive Bolts off of the carcass, so we know that Aiden had some confidence there. So you can see Aiden's not really having an issue with those three. He's having an issue with Bolts, and so as soon as Bolts comes behind him, Aiden's tail tucks and then goes back into that kind of safety zone by the window. So like I said, that's been the last week what we've been dealing with. Some days better than others, some days reverting back with a little bit of intimidation, but we definitely feel like he's part of the pack, wants to be part of the pack, and it seems to us that he gets quite a bit more confidence if the pack is focused on Bolts, meaning that he wants to kind of join in. And so this footage here just shows him kind of walking around freely, going to check out a carcass, going back to the den, and that's where his water is. He could certainly drink out of that water. Like I said, he's just in a psychological state where he's not. So here's, again, a circumstance where the pack is kind of rallying. In this case, they're going after Grayson. Not uncommon, to have one member kind of get chased, and that chase turns into a little bit of excitement. So here it's Grayson getting chased. Bolts is kind of chasing along with them. And what ends up happening in this circumstance is that Aiden gets out of his safety zone. He goes beyond the normal area that he's been isolating, and certainly causes him a little anxiety. He runs back towards the front, and you notice his tail is up. He certainly wants to be involved, and he certainly is physically able to be involved, but he's pushing the envelope of his safety zones here, and eventually what's going to happen is they're going to see that, and as soon as Bolt sees that, he kind of goes towards him, and Aiden drops his ears, drops his tail, and comes down. But they know his vulnerability, and they know his weakness, and they know that the safety zones and the not so safe zones for him. And so we had just fed a beaver that day, so you can see the pen. It's got some beaver intestines that were the ravens had picked out from the beaver there. So you can really see where they pick up his vulnerability, and it's actually Grayson who kind of redirects, and then Axel comes over with a high tail, and then Grayson starts to confront Denali and Bolt, and it's Axel that goes in for kind of a tail bite, and then obviously the focus is Axel and Bolt on Aiden. Grayson kind of defended himself, not so much going involved with grabbing Aiden, but certainly grabbing Denali. So here's the challenge, is that there's clearly some leadership issues, there's some excitement issues, there's some rallying issues that get the pack triggered. And Aiden's confidence, while it's improving, it's certainly not at the point of being able to take control of a situation because of Axel and Bolt's joining forces and making Aiden vulnerable. So again, this is circumstances that we've been kind of watching, and so we're trying to use distractions whenever possible. Blocking Bolts and Axel from Aiden makes them want to go after him even with more intensity, because obviously that's a perception that they can't get at him, so they kind of get ramped up and try to go around us and get him. So we've been really working on trying to distract, and so that means deer hides, and obviously you can see the beaver intestines that are in there. That was compliments of the ravens who dissected a beaver in there and kind of spread it all over the enclosure. Like I said, it's been cold here, no snow, so whatever we fed on Saturday night is still frozen on top of the snow. So there is a lot of raven activity. There's a lot of debris, food resources that are left in the enclosure to kind of create some distractions. But the other thing that we're noticing is that Axel and Grayson are still kind of a little bit hormonally driven. So there's times when we see them jaw sparring and wrestling, and we actually see some mounting behavior, which gives us an indication that there may be some hormonal response that's going on that's kind of triggered by this time of the year. So here's a case again where Axel is taking advantage of Grayson. Grayson's a little bit more timid, but also Grayson's being targeted a lot by Denali, and that makes it a little more challenging. So here's the dilemma. Without Aiden in the pack, there's not a clear leader that's ready to take over, and that's the issue that we faced with Shadow. And when we took Shadow out, we had issues with who was going to lead. We had a lot of chaos and a lot of conflict, and so as much as it's challenging to watch for Aiden, certainly Aiden's not ready to be removed from this pack, and certainly this pack's not ready to lead or have a clear leader without Aiden. And so this is all kind of a seasonal circumstance as temperatures warm, and we hope that happens sometime in the next week. We had one day of 30-degree weather that kind of made it even worse because it melted a lot of things and then froze up again. But in this case, once we get into consistent warm weather, I think we're going to see some dynamic changes, some hormones kind of calm a little bit. We do know that by April, prolactin hormone is going to come into play, and that's a nurturing hormone, and that's going to change kind of the nature of it. So the one challenge about having all these food resources around, especially, is that food issues are not necessarily rank issues, meaning that, when you have something, you theoretically should be able to guard it and possess it. But the reality is, when you have something and somebody else wants it, there's a lot of chasing behavior. So, like I said, the food resources are helping try to distract the pack a little bit from focusing on Aiden. And I really want to emphasize that this is just normal wolf behavior. This is normal young wolves transitioning from yearlings into 2-year-olds. We've been through it before. We always have kind of this pattern of time when they're the most rambunctious, the most driven. It doesn't mean that the pack is aggressive, really. As a matter of fact, they're actually quite calm. And this is Axel submitting to wolf care staff. So Axel, who's not a real common submitter. And again, there's Grayson taking advantage of Axel, doing a little inguinal presentation there, presenting, and Grayson coming over to check it out. But they're really not aggressive. They're just focused on Aiden's weakness, and they're taking advantage of his weakness. So, and then I see a little butt scoot there on Grayson. So that's something that we'll get a fecal on, and we'll try to check that and make sure that he's parasite free. So those butt scoots could be just anal irritation from the scent glands, but we also want to double check parasites, especially for Grayson, who's so much smaller weight than Axel. We had a weight early in February where Grayson's still in that that 82, 84 pound range, where Axel's 98 pounds. So there's always been a difference between these two, and it may just be the way they are, but we always want to double check Grayson's fecals to make sure that there's nothing parasitical going on that may be causing him some lower weight values. And Grayson is getting extra feedings. Aiden's getting extra feedings, so those two are getting some leftovers when Luna and Grizzer are done eating, to make sure that their resources are met. As a matter of fact, when I looked at that footage last Saturday, it would be Bolts who probably didn't get a fair amount of food. That food begging that we saw was probably related to the fact that Aiden was on a carcass and Denali was on the other, and Bolts probably didn't get as much food resources to be able to consume. So these bones, and this is a beaver skull here, laying here, like I said, those are, it's good things for them to chew on, to, interact with. It certainly is enrichment. And we've always been carcass feeders here. We check fecals for parasites. We feed vitamins and any other kind of supplements that they may be missing from a more traditionally commercial diet. But the benefits outweigh the risk by having all of that opportunity to interact with things and to be able to sleep with things and to be able to guard with things is real important. So the only thing that I've noticed in the last week that's causing a little bit of change is the wind. Spring is when we get winds out of the southwest. They tend to pick up, they tend to be gusty, and that also can make packs a little bit anxious just because they can't hear very well, they can't, sense of smell is kind of affected as well. So we'll keep you posted on what's going on, but that's the update for February 17th, 2018. See you next time.